World peace or peace on earth is a topic constantly tossed around but never truly considered. What is the real definition of world peace, and how can we reach this goal in the best way possible? There have been thousands of organizations formed with the sole purpose of making the world a better place, but no other has had the impact of the United Nations. With extensive work on maintaining world peace, the UN has enormously influenced the world we live in today, but with over 10% of the global population living on less than $2 a day and millions perished in the wars of our past, has the United Nations actually made a better world? The idea of an international governing body had existed for years before the formation of the UN. The League of Nations was an international organization created after World War I to help resolve international disputes. The general proposal was widely popular among the public, yet the League was unable to deliver its expectations. After 10 years of service, the world was at war again. It is argued that the League's key failures was due to poor executions by member countries, though most historians hold the USA responsible, as their little participation in the League may have led to its ineffectiveness and failed operations. 1930s, a few years after the war to end all wars, the world was at war once again, although this time people were less enthused, having witnessed the effects of World War I. As a result of the League's shortfalls, it became ineffective, and without an effective world body such as the League, many atrocities occurred. One Australian example of these atrocities was the treatment of prisoners of war by the Japanese. Initial successes against the Japanese on Kokoda Trail eventually turned the tide against them, but the atrocities committed against their enemies and local occupied populations were born out of the little alignment and recognition of world bodies. On Wednesday, the 15th of August 1945, Prime Minister Ben Chifley announced Japan's surrender, finalising the end of the war. The streets of Australia broke into excitement as thousands welcomed the peace and celebrated the return of loved ones. Yet nations were exhausted from years of warfare, with entire countries in ruins and borders realigned. With nations acquiring nuclear weapons, the world would not survive this devastation, and countries more than ever needed to work together, which led to the formation of the United Nations. On the 24th of October 1945, the United Nations was formed, with over 50 nations and non-governmental organizations attending numerous conferences to draft and later sign the Charter of the United Nations. The UN was formed with the sole purpose of creating a better global balance of peace between world powers through stability and better relations, which was the case for many years to come. By monitoring ceasefire agreements and observing demilitarization efforts, the organization achieved many of its goals over time. In fact, UN officials, agencies, and institutions have been awarded 11 Nobel Prizes for their valuable humanitarian work, yet many still feel as though some previous United Nations works have led to many of the issues that we deal with today. The General Assembly's first resolution in 1946 was to create a commission to deal with the issues associated with atomic energy, having experienced these weapons firsthand in World War II. Though these efforts seemed major at the time, the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons was only open for signature during 1968, and still only a little over half of the states involved in the United Nations have signed. There are still over 22,000 nuclear weapons situated throughout the world today, and problems involving a range of countries, such as Iran and North Korea, is evidence that these efforts have failed. In 1950, the United Nations was faced with a severe military conflict. At the end of the Second World War, the once single-nation Korea was forcibly divided by the United States into two separate nations, North and South Korea, which created discomfort in the two countries for the coming years. By June, tensions grew to the point of which communist-run North Korea performed a full-scale attack on South Korea, causing issues among the United Nations. In an attempt to convince North Korea of its withdrawal, America called on the nation during a Security Council meeting, claiming that they had broken world peace. This claim was supported by 9 out of the 11 nations, yet no change was made in Korea, resulting in the need for force. In 1953, after years of fighting and added support for the South from 16 member states, a ceasefire for the Korean War was agreed on at Panmunjom. Although at the time the United Nations efforts were considered a huge factor in the ending of the war, it is evident that the underlying problem is still relevant today, with issues arising between North and South Korea for the past decade. Another successful intervention of the United Nations was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. During October of 1962, the United States confronted the Soviet Union when the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba was made, and many feared that this may head to a full-scale nuclear war. Many of the work in solving this issue can be accredited to United Nations Secretary General U Thant, who mostly allowed time for the situation to resolve in peace. Thant helped to avoid naval confrontation between the two countries and made sure that the Soviet Union dismantled the missiles as long as the United States confirmed that they would not invade Cuba. This is another example of how the work of UN agencies and officials helped to maintain world peace through cooperation of nations. During 1959, the World Health Organization, a United Nations organization, introduced its plan to rid the world of smallpox, the infectious and incurable disease that has been a problem for civilization for over thousands of years. During the 1960s, this was still a major problem in Africa and Asia due to lack of funds and commitment. In 1967, the intensified eradication had been introduced, and countries came together with a shared goal of getting rid of the disease for good. By 1980, the World Health Assembly officially declared the disease eliminated. This is another example of how the nations of the world came together to overcome a global epidemic through the use of the United Nations. The UN's successful implementation of the Montreal Protocol is still significant today. After extensive scientific research, it was concluded that various commonly used chemicals were having devastating effects on the ozone layer, resulting in the need for a global cooperation like never seen before. On March 22, 1985, 28 countries met at the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer and together drafted the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. The treaty outlined the need for a timetable that would eventually phase out the use and consumption of ozone-depleting substances and would later become the first treaty in the history of the UN to receive universal ratification. One of the United Nations' greatest failures would be its inaction and failed prevention of the Rwandan genocide. During 1991, the African country faced a civil war, but when the US withdrew all peacekeepers from Africa in 1994 after dozens were slain in Somalia, the efforts of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda became insignificant. With hidden vetoes from the United States and France blocking further action in the country, and the changing of the Civil War's definition under international law, meant that little could be done, as over 800,000 were killed during 100 days. To today, the United Nations is still held responsible for failing to prevent the mass slaughtering, having pulled out during Rwanda's time of need. A major fault in the UN system is the use of vetoes, constitutional rights to reject proposals made, given to particular states employed in the Council, which happen to be the World War II victors. The Security Council is mainly responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security and has been in charge of solving some of society's major issues, although each amendment and treaty made are non-binding recommendations and it is up to each nation to comply, meaning there's no real order. The Security Council is made up of 5 veto-carrying permanent member states along with 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. Some of these states, although at the time appropriate, have become irrelevant as some of the world's biggest economies are not even included in these decisions, and those that are have no real effect against vetoes. I want to pause your phone while you do this. Today, the United Nations have worked on a broad range of projects including the protection and safeguarding of our human rights, peacekeeping, conflict prevention, and humanitarian assistance, having had great successes in all these fields as shown in the examples prior. Although the organisation has had its setbacks and is stuck on a biased structure, it is without a doubt the most influential and highly valued, globally focused peace initiative that has helped to create a better world for generations to come. With added support and commitment from UN members, the organisation has the potential to become the government entity that helps to clear the path to future peace.